It all started with a rumor, the kind that spreads through a small town like wildfire. A carnival, they said, was coming to our town, but not just any carnival, a cemetery carnival. I didn't believe it at first. Who would set up a carnival in a graveyard? It seemed like a bad joke, a way to spook the easily frightened. But when the flyers started appearing, fluttering on lampposts and littering the sidewalks, I knew something was different this time. The whispers grew louder, and soon it was all anyone could talk about. Halloween night, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and burning leaves. I should have stayed home. I should have ignored the pull that dragged me toward the cemetery. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and this time it might be my undoing. The gates to the cemetery were wide open, beckoning. I hesitated at the entrance, but a strange music floated through the air, luring me in. It was a haunting melody, played on an instrument I couldn't quite place, halfway between a calliope and something more sinister. The air around me felt colder, as if the warmth of the town had been sucked away the moment I crossed the threshold. The carnival was there, all right. Rows of tents and booths, each one lit with flickering lanterns that cast long dancing shadows on the gravestones. The rides towered above the mausoleums, their rusty gears creaking as they spun. There was a Ferris wheel, its skeletal frame barely visible against the night sky, and a carousel where the horses were frozen in twisted poses, their mouths open in silent screams. People from town were already wandering around, their faces pale and eyes wide with a mix of wonder and fear. The workers, dressed in old-fashioned carnival attire, moved among them, their expressions hidden behind cracked porcelain masks. Something about them made my skin crawl. Their movements were too smooth, too fluid, as if they weren't quite alive. I approached the first booth, a game of ring toss. The man behind the counter, tall and gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull, grinned at me with a mouthful of rotting teeth. The smell of decay wafted from him, but no one else seemed to notice. "Care for a try?" he rasped, his voice like the whisper of dry leaves. I picked up a ring, the metal cold and slick in my hand, and tossed it toward the bottles. It missed, clattering to the ground with a dull thud. He chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Better luck next time," he said, but there was no malice in his tone, just a strange, hollow emptiness. I moved on, my unease growing with every step. The carnival felt wrong, a distortion of reality, as if the world had slipped sideways into a nightmare. I found myself at the entrance to a tent labeled the House of Mirrors. The flaps rustled as if beckoning me inside, and before I knew it, I had stepped through. Inside, the mirrors lined the walls, distorting my reflection into grotesque shapes. My heart pounded as I walked deeper into the maze. Each step seemed to take me further from the entrance, and soon I realized I couldn't find my way back. My reflection twisted and turned, showing me images of myself that didn't make sense, my face grinning when I wasn't smiling, my eyes staring back with a malevolence I didn't feel. Suddenly, the mirrors began to shift, the glass warping and bulging as if something was trying to break through from the other side. I froze, watching in horror as the reflections twisted into monstrous versions of me, faces stretched into inhuman grins, eyes black as voids, and hands clawing at the glass. Then with a loud crack, the mirrors shattered and I was plunged into darkness. I stumbled, feeling broken glass under my feet. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to find my way out. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and I could hear whispers all around me, voices too low to understand but filled with malice. Just as panic began to overtake me, a light flickered ahead. I ran toward it, bursting through the tent flaps and into the open air, my heart still racing. But the carnival was different now. The lights were dimmer, the music slower and more discordant. The people, no, not people, were staring at me, their masks cracked open to reveal hollow, skeletal faces beneath. I realized, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that they weren't just carnival workers. They were the dead, the restless spirits of those buried in this very cemetery, drawn back by whatever dark power had created this twisted carnival. I turned to leave, but the gate was gone. In its place was a towering black fence, the iron bars slick with something wet and dark. I was trapped. I had been lured into their world, and now there was no way out. The dead closed in around me, their grins widening as the carnival's lights flickered one by one, plunging me into darkness. And then I heard it, the sound of a bell tolling, deep and resonant, echoing through the night. It was a death knell, and I knew with a bone-chilling certainty that it was tolling for me. The bell's toll echoed in my mind long after the sound faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. The carnival lights had all but gone out, and the air felt thick as if it were suffocating me. The grinning faces of the dead were now gone, swallowed by the darkness. but I knew they were still there, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for me to make a wrong move. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a countdown to something dreadful. I had to get out of here, but every path I tried seemed to twist back on itself, leading me deeper into the maze of tents and rides. The carnival was no longer a place of eerie curiosity. It had become a labyrinth, a trap with no exit. As I wandered, the carnival seemed to shift around me, the rides and booths rearranging themselves as if the very ground beneath my feet was alive. My pulse quickened as I realized I wasn't just lost, I was being led somewhere. The sound of distant laughter reached my ears, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the kind of laughter you'd hear from someone enjoying themselves. No, this was something darker, something that spoke of cruelty and malice. I followed the sound, unable to resist, drawn in like a moth to a flame. The source of the laughter was a tent, larger than the others, its striped fabric torn and stained. The entrance flaps swayed gently, as if in a breeze I couldn't feel. The sign above the entrance read, "The Ringmaster's Show," in faded letters that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But something pulled me forward, something more powerful than fear. I pushed aside the flaps and stepped into the tent. The interior was vast, far larger than it had any right to be. The ceiling stretched high above, lost in shadows, and rows of seats circled a central stage. The stage itself was empty, save for a single spotlight that flickered on as I entered, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. I stood there, at the edge of the light, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome! Welcome!" the voice boomed, full of dark amusement. "We've been expecting you." I turned in circles, trying to find the source of the voice, but the tent was empty. No, not empty. There were figures in the seats, shadowy shapes that seemed to watch me with unseen eyes. I could feel their gazes, heavy and malevolent, pressing down on me from all sides. A figure stepped into the spotlight, emerging from the shadows as if materializing from the darkness itself. He was tall, impossibly tall, dressed in a tattered ringmaster's coat, his face hidden behind a mask that looked like it had been carved from bone. In one hand he held a cane topped with a skull, its empty eye sockets glowing with a faint, unnatural light. "Tonight's show," he continued, his voice oozing with sinister glee, "is a special one, a performance just for you." The spotlight expanded, illuminating the stage where 3 large cages stood, covered with heavy black cloths. My stomach twisted as the ringmaster moved to the first cage, his movements slow and deliberate as if savoring the moment. "With each act," he said, "a part of you will be revealed. By the end, there will be nothing left but the truth." He yanked the cloth off the first cage, and I recoiled in horror. Inside was a figure, hunched and broken, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It was a grotesque parody of a human, its skin pale and mottled with deep black pits where its eyes should have been. The creature let out a low, guttural moan, its mouth full of jagged teeth that gnashed together in a sickening rhythm. "This," the ringmaster said with a smile in his voice, "is your fear." The creature lunged at the bars, its claws raking against the metal as it strained to reach me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as I realized the cage was slowly opening. I turned to run, but the tent had changed again. The entrance was gone, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. The only way out was forward, through whatever horrors the ringmaster had planned for me. "Don't be afraid," the ringmaster crooned, his voice wrapping around me like a cold embrace. "There's so much more to see." He moved to the second cage, and I knew I had no choice but to follow. The cloth dropped away, revealing another monstrosity. This one was larger, its body covered in patches of fur and scales, its face a grotesque amalgamation of features. Too many eyes, too many mouths, all of them whispering, screaming, laughing. "This," the ringmaster intoned, "is your guilt." The creature's voices rose in a cacophony, each one accusing, mocking, reminding me of every mistake, every failure, every moment I wished I could forget. The sound burrowed into my mind, tearing at my sanity until I was on the verge of collapse. And still the cage began to open. The ringmaster was at the third cage now, his hand poised to reveal whatever fresh horror awaited me. My body trembled with a fear I had never known, a fear that came from deep within, from the darkest corners of my soul. The ringmaster paused, his head tilting as if he could sense my terror. "The final act," he said, "is the most revealing of all." He tore the cloth away and my heart nearly stopped. Inside the cage was me. Not a twisted creature or a monstrous reflection, but me, whole and unharmed. But the eyes, my eyes, were empty, devoid of life, staring back at me with a cold, dead gaze. "This," the ringmaster whispered, his voice now soft, almost tender, "is your soul." The cage door swung open and my doppelganger stepped out, moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as it reached out, its cold fingers brushing against my cheek. The ringmaster's laughter echoed in my ears, growing louder, more manic, as the world around me began to blur, the shadows closing in. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own face, twisted into a grin that didn't belong to me, and the ringmaster's voice whispering in my ear, "Welcome to the carnival." Then there was nothing. When I awoke, the world had shifted again. I was no longer in the tent, no longer surrounded by the twisted, nightmarish reflections of myself. Instead, I found myself standing in the heart of the carnival, but it was different now, more decayed, more rotten, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the once lively music had slowed to a mournful dirge that echoed in the distance, a ghostly reminder of the nightmare that had taken hold of this place. I staggered forward, every muscle in my body screaming in pain. My mind was a haze of confusion and fear, but one thought pushed through the fog. I had to escape. I didn't know where the ringmaster or those other things had gone, and I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of this cursed carnival, out of this graveyard of nightmares. The carnival was nearly empty now, the booths and rides standing silent and still, their once bright colors faded and peeling. The few figures I could see were mere shadows, flitting at the edges of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned to look at them directly. They were watching me, I knew, waiting for something, but I couldn't focus on that. I had to find a way out. I made my way through the carnival, each step slow and hesitant, the ground beneath my feet soft and yielding, as if I were walking on freshly turned earth. I reached the Ferris wheel, its once majestic frame now rusted and crumbling, towering over me like a skeletal giant. The seats swayed gently in the wind, empty except for the faint echoes of laughter that had long since died. Something caught my eye, a flash of movement among the shadows. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the base of the Ferris wheel, was a figure. Not one of the carnival workers or the dead, no, this was someone real, someone like me. A glimmer of hope surged through me, and I moved toward the figure, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and dread. As I approached, the figure became clearer. A man slumped against one of the Ferris wheel supports, his clothes tattered and dirty. He was breathing, but just barely, each breath a ragged, painful sound that filled the silent air. I knelt beside him, my hands trembling as I reached out. "Hey," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Are you okay?" His head lifted slowly and I recoiled in horror. His face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over his bones, eyes sunken and hollow. But the worst part was his mouth, stitched shut with thick black thread, the stitches so tight they had cut into his flesh. Blood oozed from the wounds, dark and thick, staining his teeth and chin. He tried to speak, his eyes wide with desperation, but only a muffled groan escaped his sealed lips. I could see the terror in his eyes, the pleading, as if he were begging me to help him, to release him from whatever hell he was trapped in. I scrambled back, my mind racing. What was this place? What had happened to him? And what was going to happen to me if I didn't get out of here? A sound from above made me look up. The Ferris wheel was moving, slowly creaking into motion. The seats began to turn, one by one, and as they came into view, I saw what they carried. Bodies, slumped and lifeless, each one grotesquely contorted, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable pain. The Ferris wheel was a carousel of the damned, a grotesque mockery of the joy it once represented. I stumbled to my feet, my entire body shaking with terror. I had to leave now. But the path ahead was blocked by something that made my blood run cold. The ringmaster. He stood there, tall and imposing, his cracked porcelain mask hiding whatever expression lay beneath. In his hand, he held the skull-topped cane, tapping it rhythmically against the ground as he regarded me with a dark, amused gaze. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice echoing through the empty carnival. "The show's not over yet." My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind screaming at me to run, to do anything to get away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The ringmaster moved toward me, slow and deliberate, and as he did, the ground began to tremble. The earth beneath the carnival was shifting, the ground cracking open to reveal dark, gaping chasms. From those chasms rose figures, more of the dead, their skeletal hands clawing at the earth as they dragged themselves up from their graves. Their eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light, and their mouths twisted into hideous grins as they swarmed toward me. The ringmaster watched, his gaze never leaving mine, as if daring me to try and escape. The dead were closing in, their hollow laughter echoing through the air, their bony fingers reaching out to grasp me, to pull me down into the darkness. I finally found the strength to move, turning on my heel and sprinting away from the ringmaster. away from the Ferris wheel of the dead, away from the graves that were vomiting forth the damned. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. The carnival twisted and shifted around me, the paths changing, leading me deeper into the nightmare. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving, had to keep running, or I would be lost forever in this hellish place. But no matter how far I ran, the dead were always right behind me, their laughter growing louder, their presence pressing in on all sides. Suddenly I saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance, the first sign of hope since this nightmare began. I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in protest, as I sprinted toward the light. It was coming from a small tent, isolated from the rest of the carnival, its fabric torn and fluttering in the wind. I reached the tent and dove inside, collapsing onto the ground, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The air was heavy with the smell of wax and incense, a strange, almost comforting contrast to the death and decay outside. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. In the center of the tent stood an old man, his face hidden by the shadows, his back hunched with age. He was hunched over a table, muttering to himself as he worked on something I couldn't see. The sense of relief that had flooded me upon finding the tent was quickly replaced by unease. There was something wrong with this place, something deeply unsettling. The old man didn't seem to notice me, or if he did, he didn't care. His muttering grew louder, more frantic, as his hands moved quickly over the table, shaping and molding something with feverish intensity. I edged closer, trying to see what he was doing. As I stepped into the light, he looked up, his eyes gleaming with a strange, almost manic light. I froze as his gaze locked onto mine, and a slow, twisted smile spread across his face. "You've made it far," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked like old parchment. "But you can't leave. Not yet. The carnival has claimed you." I shook my head, backing away, but he stood up, revealing what he had been working on. A doll. It was small but intricately detailed, and as I looked closer, I realized with horror that it was a perfect likeness of me. The features were uncanny, down to the clothes I was wearing, the expression on my face, the fear in my eyes. He held the doll up, inspecting it with a satisfied grin. "The ringmaster sent you to me," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're part of the show now, whether you like it or not." I stared at the doll, my heart pounding in my chest. This was impossible, a nightmare within a nightmare. But as I watched, the old man produced a long, rusted needle from his sleeve, holding it over the doll's chest. "No!" I screamed, lunging forward, but he was too quick. The needle plunged into the doll's chest, and I felt it. A sharp, searing pain that tore through my body, radiating out from my heart. I collapsed to the ground, clutching my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pain was unbearable, like nothing I had ever felt before. I looked up at the old man, his grin wide and triumphant, the doll still clutched in his bony hand. "Welcome to the carnival," he whispered, his voice echoing in my ears as the world faded to black once again. And in that darkness, I heard the sound of the ringmaster's laughter, growing louder and louder until it was the only thing left. When I awoke again, I was lying on the cold, hard ground, the echo of the ringmaster's laughter still ringing in my ears. My chest throbbed with the memory of the pain, but when I touched it, there was no wound, no sign of the needle that had plunged into my heart. I was alive, but how? And why? Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, my body trembling with the effort. The tent around me was gone, replaced by an open field where the carnival had once stood. The rides, the tents, the macabre attractions, all of it had vanished, leaving behind only an empty graveyard, silent and still under the pale light of dawn. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the tombstones and the dew-covered grass. I took a deep breath, the fresh morning air filling my lungs, clearing my mind of the nightmare that had held me captive. The terror and despair of the night before began to fade, replaced by a strange, almost overwhelming sense of peace. It was over. Somehow I had survived, but the question lingered, how? I looked around, searching for any sign of the ringmaster, the old man, or the creatures that had haunted the carnival. There was nothing. It was as if the entire place had been a twisted dream, a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. The fear, the pain, it had all been real. I started to walk, my steps unsteady at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The path through the graveyard was clear now, leading me back toward the entrance. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Flowers were blooming among the graves, vibrant and colorful, their petals catching the light of the rising sun. The cemetery, once a place of decay and darkness, was coming to life. The further I walked, the more the cemetery transformed. The grass, once brown and withered, was lush and green. and the trees, which had stood like twisted, lifeless sentinels, were now full of leaves, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. It was as if the cemetery itself was waking up from a long, dark sleep. I reached the gates and stopped, turning back to look at the graveyard one last time. The fear that had gripped me so tightly had melted away, replaced by a sense of calm and closure. The carnival, whatever dark force had brought it here, was gone, and in its place was something beautiful, something peaceful. As I stood there, I heard a soft rustling behind me. I turned to see a group of people, townsfolk, the same ones who had been drawn to the carnival the night before. They were emerging from the cemetery, their faces bright with wonder and relief. They too had survived. We looked at each other, and without a word, we knew we had been through something terrible, something that had tested us in ways we couldn't fully understand. But we had made it through. Together, we had broken the spell. One by one, they began to smile, and the tension in the air lifted. It was over. We were free. I turned back to the cemetery one last time, a small smile playing on my lips. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the graves, but those shadows no longer felt menacing. They were simply part of the world, part of the balance between light and dark. As I stepped through the gates, leaving the cemetery behind, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Whatever dark power had controlled the carnival was gone, and with it, the nightmares that had plagued this town. I walked away from the cemetery, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, the cool breeze in my hair. The town was waking up, and with it, a new day was beginning. A day free from the fear that had haunted us all. I knew I would never forget what had happened, the terror I had faced, the horrors I had seen. But I also knew that it was over. The carnival, the ringmaster, the twisted reflections of my soul, they were all part of the past now, and the future was mine to shape. As I walked toward the town, I realized that the nightmare had left me with something unexpected, a sense of hope. The world was full of darkness, yes, but it was also full of light. And as long as there was light, there was a way forward. The cemetery, once a place of fear, had become a place of peace. And with that peace came the promise of new beginnings. The nightmare was over, and I was free. And in that freedom, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: joy.